La admiro muchísimo y es un gran gusto tenerlo con nosotros. En términos de logística, la presentación de Steve va a ser en dos partes. Entonces vamos a tener una pequeña pausa en el medio y también van a tener un espacio para hacer sus preguntas. Entonces, si tienen preguntas a Steve, las pueden poner mientras tanto en el chat. Yo voy a estar pendiente de esto. O más o menos después de una hora, cuando termina la primera parte, van a tener un espacio para prender sus cámaras y hacer preguntas. Y al final, igual. La presentación, Steve, la va a hacer en inglés. Entonces, si hay alguna pregunta de comprensión, la pueden hacer, yo la puedo traducir, ¿no? Pónganlo en el chat igual. O si tienen alguna pregunta, yo me encargo de hacer una pequeña traducción, ¿vale? Entonces, con esto ya estamos. Steve, thanks so much for being here. And the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Jonas. Yeah, lo siento, mi español es mal. So I will be hablo in inglés. Lo siento. Yes, I'm sure Jonas just introduced me adequately, so I won't dwell on that. I've actually taught on the this course before in CIDE, in Aguascalientes, and I had a very good experience with the course. I hope you're all getting a lot out of the course. It's very unique, I think, in the world, in fact, not just in Mexico, in the world, to do a course like this on drugs and drug policy. So I'm very excited to be a part of it. I've actually been involved with drug policy in Mexico for about 10 or 11 years. I don't know whether Jonas mentioned, but Transform, my organization, Transform, have a partnership with Mexico Unido contra Delincuencia. I hope I pronounced that right. MUCD. I've been working with Lisa Sanchez and the MUCD team for a number of years and on drug policy in Mexico and, in fact, all of Latin America. And I think we've had a positive impact, certainly in Mexico. I know things are difficult in Mexico at the moment with drug policy, but with MUCD, we took the Supreme Court case, well, the series of Supreme Court cases around cannabis that I think Lisa Sanchez is doing a session. Is that right, Jonas? Or has she done it already? I'm not sure. Anyway, she's
doing the last kind of public conference. So she's gonna
right.
close the course.
Right. Well, she's amazing, and she'll tell you all about the work that she's been doing. But we've been working very closely with her because, of course, drug policy, it's not just about Mexico. Drug policy is international. Drug markets are international, and the international laws that shape our drug policy is also international. So we have these various international forces that influence policy for you in Mexico and for us in the UK. We are all interrelated. So I think the international perspective is enormously important. And my organization and MUCD in Mexico have been working in this international space now for many years. And in a range of different forums. We work with international non-government organizations or NGOs. We work with civil society and groups that represent impacted communities, including drug producers and drug traffickers and people who use drugs as well. And we also work in international forums, including the United Nations, and other regional forums. Lisa, I'm sure, will tell you about her work with some of the Latin American forums and some of the North American forums as well, such as the OAS, the Organization of American States, that do a certain amount of drug policy work that Lisa has been very involved with, and Transform and myself have been very supportive of that work. And Lisa has and MUCD have translated a number of Transform's reports and books and publications. We have translated a number of MUCD reports and publications into English, and we have worked on a number of collaborative reports as well. And these reports are available in English and in Spanish on the Transform website and on the MUCD website. And I will include the links in my presentation. I think Jonas said we have 2 hours. It's quite a long time. So I'm going to do a presentation, I think, to start with, a general presentation about theory and practice of regulation. What are we talking about when we talk about legalization and regulation? What does that actually mean? And then after that presentation, if anyone has any questions, I can try and answer those questions then. Maybe we'll have a short 5-minute break, and then we'll come back, and I want to do a case study on the legalization and regulation of cocaine. And I will explain why we're focusing on coca and cocaine when we get there. But I hope it's interesting. Cannabis legalization regulation is a fairly well-trodden path, a fairly well-explored public debate. But cocaine is much more challenging and much more difficult. And this course, I think, is here to challenge you. And that's presumably why they've invited me to do something a little bit more challenging. So we will be talking about cocaine in the second part of the session. So I am going to share my screen, my presentation. Hang on a minute. I hope you can all see that. Can you give me a thumbs up, Jonas? Great. So here's my email, steve@transformdrugs.org. Please do feel free to contact me if you have any follow-up questions. And @SteveTransform is my Twitter handle if you want to follow me on Twitter. Let's see if I can do this. So here you can see, I'm just going to move that up there. Sorry, I'm just organizing my, oops, going back. So I'm just organizing my screen a bit. So I don't want to see my own face. Right. Okay. Yes, and please do put messages or any questions in the chat, or you can ask the questions in person when we get to the question section. So these are some of the publications that Transform, my organization, has produced with our colleagues in Mexico. The first one is a guide to legalization and regulation of all drugs, a sort of general theoretical overview of regulation of all drugs. The second one, Cómo regular el cannabis, un guía práctica. Don't know how my Spanish accent is there. Focuses on cannabis, obviously. And that book has been very important for us. It's opened doors to work with the Uruguayan government and the Mexican governments, various Mexican governments. And more recently, the Colombian government. Colombia are in the process of legalizing cannabis now. And we've also been to Chile with that book and presented the book in the Chilean Senate. And later this month, I'm going to Brazil. It's been translated into Portuguese, and we will be presenting that book in the Portuguese, in the Brazilian Senate in Brasilia. This third book here, Terminando la Guerra contra las Drogas, is a kind of guidebook to the debate, how to make the case and argue for reform, how to argue for legalization and regulation of all drugs. So it's a very detailed book to guide you if you want to get involved in the public debate. I hope this is a very useful guide to how to make the arguments, the different arguments to make, and how to make those arguments for different audiences. Because obviously you need to shape your message for different audiences. If you're speaking to police, if you're speaking to families, if you're speaking to politicians from the left or the right, you need to shape your message to appeal to them and meet them where they are and help them to understand the reasons for change and reform. And this final book, Cómo regular los estimulantes, una guía práctica, is our newest book, which is focusing on stimulants, which is what I'm going to be talking about later. So it doesn't just look at cocaine. We also look at amphetamines, methamphetamine, amphetamines, and MDMA, ecstasy. Yeah, so it looks at stimulants generally, but there are separate chapters on different drugs. And just so you know, we have a new book coming out in the next month or two that looks at psychedelics. So we'll be looking at psilocybin mushrooms, LSD, mescaline, and DMT. So we'll look at how do you regulate these different types of drugs in different environments. So firstly, just a couple of definitions, and my apologies if this is all stuff that you know already. But I think it's good to be clear when we're talking about legalization and regulation that they are different things. They're not the same thing. So legalization is a process. That's important. That third word is very important. It's a process. It's not a policy. It's a process by which the prohibition of a substance or drug is ended, allowing for its production, availability, and use to be legally regulated. So legalization is the process. Regulation is the policy endpoint. Regulation is where you get to. So legalization doesn't say anything about the regulation model that follows. And you need to specify what you plan to do after you regulate, after you legalize, because there are different ways to regulate drugs. You can have a very government-intensive, interventionist control model, or you could have a kind of legal free market model, and I'll come back to that. So regulation describes how states legally control the market in a given drug or activities related to it. This control will usually involve a combination of licensing, i.e., the conditions under which the production or retail are permitted. It will also include controls on taxation and pricing, and global controls on aspects such as marketing and advertising, packaging requirements, or sales to children. But we'll come back to some of this detail in a minute. Just let me open this up so I know how I'm doing for time. So the context, where are we up to? The debate on the regulation on drugs has moved decisively from the margins into the mainstream political discourse. When I began this job more than 20 years ago, Transform were calling for the legalization and regulation of cannabis and other drugs. And we were seen as quite extreme. We were seen as, we had people shouting at us that we were child killers and that we were terrorists and that we were extremists. But actually, it has moved from the extremes very much into the mainstream. Legalization and regulation of cannabis and other drugs is now being explored in countries across the world on every continent. And from 10 years ago, when there was nowhere had legal cannabis, today we have legal cannabis either already implemented or in the process of being implemented, like in Mexico, on every continent. There's almost 1 billion people now live in jurisdictions with legal cannabis. If you include Canada and Mexico and Colombia and now Germany and Thailand, South Africa, Switzerland, Luxembourg, and many others. I'll come back to some of those examples later. But it's, this is no longer just a theoretical debate. This isn't just people like me writing, boring books about what legalization might be like. It's actually, it's happening around the world. And it's not just decriminalization. It's actually the legalization and regulation of drugs, not just cannabis, that were previously prohibited, and often subject to very harsh penalties. So regulation is now a core part of the discourse, the political discourse, not just in Mexico or in the region, but across the world, all the way up to the UN. And for that reason, it's very important that we are able to support and inform that debate in a clear, coherent, and positive way. And that is what Transform's work seeks to achieve and seeks to facilitate. Clearly, regulation is only one part of the jigsaw. The drug policy is a complex area. We have to think about how we address people with drug problems, how we educate people about drug risks, how we try and prevent problematic drug use emerging in the first place, how we help keep people safe. There are many dimensions to drug policy. I'm not suggesting that regulation is the only issue, or it's even the most important issue, but it is the issue that my work is focused on, and it's the issue that we're going to focus on today. So just to dig into this idea of regulation a bit more, when we talk about regulation, what do we really mean? And I think it's important to remember that regulation of risky products and behaviors is one of the primary functions of governments. It's one of the things that we elect governments to do. We elect them to protect us and to keep us safe from a range of risks. And actually, if you look around you, almost everything around you is regulated in some way. So I'm looking at my chair here, and there's foam in this chair that is regulated to make sure that it's fire retardant. I've got my computer is plugged into the wall. That plug is regulated so that there is an earth wire, and it doesn't catch fire and burn my house down. Literally everything in my room is regulated in some way, whether it's everything that you do. There are speed limits on the roads. Your cars are heavily regulated to make sure that they are safe, so that when you crash, and hit your face, there's an airbag. These things are all regulated, and it's one of the key things that governments do. And with drugs also, whether it's alcohol, you have ingredients listed. You know how much alcohol there is in a bottle of alcohol when you buy it. You know how much nicotine there is in a packet of cigarettes when you buy it. When you buy drugs in the pharmacist, they're very clearly labeled, and by law, these are legally mandated regulations telling you what is in those drugs and what the risks are. And children can't buy them. Some drugs you can buy over the counter, other drugs you need a prescription for. So all of these things, regulation is a key part of our civil institutions. But for this group of substances and behaviors, certain drugs, not all drugs, because not all drugs are legalized and are legally regulated, but certain drugs, cannabis, cocaine, ecstasy, heroin, they exist outside of those regulatory frameworks. So the same regulatory logic that we use for all of these other things is not applied to this group of drugs, these particular drugs. Again, not all drugs, just some drugs. So actually, in many ways, you can look at regulation of risky products as being the normal way that we manage things in society. It's what we do. It's what governments do. And it's prohibition, the idea that you would have a complete prohibition on certain substances or certain drugs and certain behaviors related to those drugs, which you can view as the radical experiment. Because it's quite a new idea. Prohibitions haven't really been around for that long. I mean, you can trace contemporary prohibitions back maybe 100 years to some of the early international agreements around opium prohibitions. And maybe prohibition in its modern form emerged, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And in the 60s, it was sort of cemented into a global prohibitionist regime under the United Nations drug treaties, of which there are now 3. But regulation is the norm. It's how institutions work. It's how we are protected from risks, both of products and behaviors. And we can certainly view prohibition as the radical departure from that, right? It's quite perverse. It's quite unusual if you look at the whole of social policy. Of course, regulation models vary enormously. It depends on the products. It depends on the particular risks. It depends on the environment in which regulation is being implemented. There is no single regulation model for drugs. It will vary between jurisdictions and between drugs and between different preparations of the same drug and for different groups within a population for the same drug also. So it's actually quite a complicated set of interventions, and it's not a homogeneous policy by any stretch. And I think finally, it's important to be clear that activities that exist outside of the regulatory framework will remain prohibited. So regulation establishes the parameters, the boundaries of what is permitted and what is not permitted. Things that take place outside of those boundaries, such as, for example, selling drugs to children or telling lies on the packaging. So you say that your bottle of wine is 10% alcohol and actually it's 20% alcohol. Those sorts of behaviors remain prohibited and remain subject to some sanctions. Now, the nature of those sanctions will vary on the depending on how serious the offense is. If you're selling to children, that's quite a serious offense. If you're selling poison to children, that's a very serious offense and probably a criminal offense rather than just something that you would get a fine for. But again, regulatory legalization and regulation does not mean everything is allowed. So some things still remain prohibited outside of your regulatory framework. Now, why do we want to legalize and regulate drugs? Well, I think the starting point for this is to say, what is it that we want our drug policy to achieve? Why do we have drug policy? What do we want our drug policy, whether it's prohibition or whether it's legalization and regulation, what do we actually want it to do? What do we want it to deliver? And I've put some basic bullet points here on what our priorities are, and probably what the priorities of most people are. These are things that everybody is going to agree with. We all want to protect and improve public health. particularly of young people and vulnerable people. We all want to reduce drug-related crime. We all want to reduce corruption. We all want to reduce violence. We all want to improve security and development. I've already said that the interests of the young and vulnerable in a society are particularly important. We all want to protect human rights and promote social justice. And we all believe that policy should be based on evidence of what works and what provides good value for money for taxpayers, because we, the taxpayers, are paying for this policy. So we expect it to deliver on its promises. Now, interestingly, those points are actually common ground. I've called them priorities and common ground. They're common ground between all sides of the debate, because everybody agrees on this. Nobody is going to argue that they want a policy that undermines public health or that increases violence. And actually, if you can agree on these points, it's actually a very useful starting point in the debate. If you can find, if you're, say you're arguing for legalization and regulation of all drugs against someone who is maybe a politician who wants to maintain prohibition, maintain the war on drugs, a good start is to agree on these points. Yes, we all agree with health. We all want to reduce crime. We all support human rights. Because if you can agree on this, it's actually a useful starting point, because then you can say, is the current war on drugs achieving these goals? And, you know, obviously, it isn't. It's doing the opposite of all of these things. And you can just look at the data, you know, drug use and addiction and deaths is going up. We're seeing huge amounts of drug-related crime and corruption and violence. Obviously, in Mexico, something you know a lot about. Security is being undermined by the cartels. Development is being, prevented. Young people and vulnerable people tend to disproportionately carry the costs of these failures in terms of violence and health costs. Human rights are being undermined. Social justice is not being delivered. And it all adds up to terrible value for money. So if you can find agreement on what you want your drug policy to deliver, it's actually a really good starting point for a critique of the failings of drug policy, because clearly drug policy is not doing any of these things. And if you can agree that current drug policy isn't working, you then have a very good foundation to say, okay, what changes could we do to policy that would deliver on these goals that we all share, that would deliver better on all of these goals? And you can then start to make the case for reform, whether it's for a public health approach to drugs, whether it's for decriminalization, or whether it's for the legalization and regulation of cannabis or other drugs. And you know, as soon as you start to that basis, it moves away from some of the common problems that you often get in this debate, that if you call for legalization, somehow you're pro-drugs, you're on the side of the drugs, or you have some sinister intent. You know, you're working with the cartels, or you're working with the big pharmaceutical industries and just want to make money. It's like, no, none of those things are true. What we want is public health and reduce crime and human rights and social justice and to improve security. And it's a really good way to change the focus of the debate away from some of the sort of problematic pathways that it can often go down in media debate. In terms of what regulation means in practice, again, I think it's useful to spell this out, because you force people to think about these questions. If you say, okay, when we legalize drugs, what can we then regulate? Because obviously, when drugs are prohibited, you can't regulate anything. You can't regulate any of these things. So with legal drugs, and you can just point to the legal drugs, and we will come back to this, but With legal products or legal risky products, you can regulate the production and transit. Who makes them? Where do they make them? How are they transported around? You can regulate the products themselves. So their dosage, how potent, how strong are these drugs? How much alcohol is in the bottle? How much nicotine is in the cigarette? How much THC is in the weed? How strong is this cocaine? How much MDMA is in this pill? You can regulate the preparation. Is it being prepared for drinking? Is it for smoking? Is it for injecting? Is it for snorting? Different preparations are associated with different risks. These are things that you can regulate. You can regulate the price. It's a very useful tool, actually, price regulation, because we know that if you put the price of a product up, people will tend to buy less of it. So when we increase the taxes on cigarettes, we see that smoking goes down. But if you put the price up too much, then you can encourage an illegal market that is competing with the legal market. So there are difficult questions here, and it's not always easy, but price is a very useful tool. And packaging. So we need to be careful about branding and advertising and, glamorous packaging that makes things look tempting and interesting, particularly for young people. And packaging, you can also put information and health warnings on the product, so that people are able to make informed choices about their drug using behaviors and the risks that they're taking. Excuse me a moment. I'm just going to try and get this, change my view. Just give me a second. It's not really working. How do I move that up there now? Okay, not to worry. You can regulate the vendors. Who sells the drugs? Where are they available from? Are the vendors licensed? Do they have to have specific training requirements so that when you buy drugs, they can give you health advice and risk and safety advice? A bit like when you buy a drug from a pharmacist, over the counter, they can give you advice about those drugs. Do we make that requirement if people are selling drugs for non-medical use, as well as pharmaceutical medical drugs? The outlets. So the outlets is, where are the drugs sold from? Where would the shops be located? Do we want drug shops near to schools, for example? Is there a danger that if you have too many outlets, you're somehow going to be encouraging increases in use? So the location and the appearance of the outlets. Do we allow flashy advertising and signs and, come in and buy two, get one free? Signage, or do people just have to know where these shops are and you have plain exteriors? And the hours of opening, should they just be able to open during the day? Should they be open in the evening? Should they be able to open all night? These are similar questions to alcohol sales, as is clear. So all of these questions, you could apply them to alcohol and tobacco regulation as well. Marketing, we regulate marketing, very important. Advertising, branding, promotions. Do we want celebrity endorsed cocaine? If we legalize cocaine, do we want, Tom Cruise or Rihanna advertising cocaine? Do we want, billboards on the highways advertising cannabis? No, I don't think we do personally. But these are things that we have with alcohol and to a certain extent with tobacco. And we need to think about them. These are very important considerations. And finally, we can regulate the buyers or users. So who has access to the market? Most obviously is age controls. I think most people would agree that if we do legalize drugs, the right to access and use those drugs is restricted to adults. It's not necessarily something that you want children to do, because obviously the risks of drugs are more profound for children. And also children by their nature, because they're not adults, are not necessarily able to make informed decisions in the way that adults can. So age controls on sales of drugs, I think, is very important. But there are other issues you could have there. Say, would you have membership-based clubs or associations where you could only access drugs if you became a member of an association or a club? And there could be additional tiers of control, possibly for more risky drugs. But these are all questions that we need to ask. So for each drug, in each environment, we have to go through and answer what is going to be the best way to regulate that particular drug in this particular location to deliver on those goals that we talked about in the previous slide that we all share. Now, we have a whole range of regulatory tools that we can apply. There's a flexible menu of options that we would apply to different products in different environments. And this is very much the kind of structure of many of Transform's books. So if you go to the cocaine book, for example, or the stimulants book, we go through and we go bang, bang, bang. We kind of try and answer all these questions. And that's what I'm going to come back to in the second part of today's talk. But the interesting thing is, if you ask the same questions with cannabis, you get a different set of answers to if we're talking about ecstasy or heroin or cocaine or alcohol or whatever it is, or nicotine vapes, for example. So different drugs, you use your toolbox of regulatory tools in different ways. And again, it depends on the country, it depends on the region within the country, and it depends on the drug. Oops. So this graph, what this graph does is it tries to capture the general concept of why we think drugs should be regulated. Now, up the y-axis, you can see on the left, it says social and health harms. So the y-axis is higher levels of social health harms or lower levels of social and health harms. And along the x-axis is a spectrum of different forms of drug policy, going from full-on war on drugs, ultra prohibition over on the left, through softer forms of prohibition, to legal regulation in the middle there, all the way over to legal drugs on the right, which can either be lightly regulated, or if you go all the way over to the right, commercially promoted. So a kind of free market, libertarian free market model over there on the right. And our view is that it's this point in the middle, this sort of blue bit where it says strict legal regulation, where we think is the sensible place, is the optimal place for drug policy to gravitate towards, because you can see the social and health harms are at the lowest point. And at either side, if you go all the way to the left or all the way to the right, you start to see social and health harms rising, even on the side with the legal drugs, because in a free market, in an unregulated legal market, you also have that lack of regulation. And it's the lack of regulation which is the problem. So in a free market, if you think about alcohol or tobacco, maybe 40, 50 years ago, they weren't regulated very well at all. There was no health warnings on the packets of tobacco. Taxes were very low. They were aggressively marketed and advertised, and smoking rates were really, really high. And smoking is very bad for you. And there was very serious public health consequences of having an unregulated market in tobacco. And on the other side, you see unregulated criminal markets. So all the way over there on the left also have a very high level of social and health harms, similarly because they are unregulated. There is no opportunity at either end of this graph for the government to make the kind of interventions that can help moderate some of those risks and reduce the social and health harms. That's why we believe that it's a form of strict legal regulation. So yes, we should legalize drugs, but we should regulate them strictly as appropriate to their risks. Because if you don't regulate them strictly enough, you move from a war on drugs over on the left, then you legalize, but then you go too far over to the right and you start to have unregulated legal markets, and the harms, social and health harms, start to rise again. So moving on, where are we up to with this debate? Have we reached a tipping point? And when I say tipping point, I kind of mean, I don't know whether you're familiar with that phrase, but it's kind of, have we reached a threshold where the momentum becomes inevitable towards change and reform? On decriminalization, I think definitely. And when I say decriminalization, I mean ending the criminalization of people who use drugs. So not legalization and regulation, ending the criminalization of people who use drugs. So if you're caught in possession of drugs for your personal use, you are not arrested and prosecuted, and you don't get a criminal record. So in theory, that happens in Mexico, but I think in reality, the thresholds for personal possession are very low, and a lot of your police either don't know the law or they're very corrupt. And obviously, it's still the case that many people are being criminalized for the personal use, possession and use of drugs, even cannabis, in Mexico. But in multiple countries across the world, decriminalization of cannabis, or in many cases of all drugs, has now become policy. So there's between 25 and 40 different countries around the world have some form of decriminalization. Now, it's defined differently, and we need to be a bit careful making generalizations, but it is an accelerating trend. So not just multiple countries, but we see multiple agencies. So many police agencies and many health agencies also support ending the criminalization of people who use drugs. So health agencies are saying we can't have a public health response to drugs when the population of people who we are trying to help, we are criminalizing them at the same time. We're trying to help these people, but we're also trying to arrest them. It just doesn't make sense. So we're seeing an increasing number of health agencies, colleges of medicine, journals like the Lancet and the British Medical Journal, leading journals, saying that we really shouldn't be criminalizing drugs. And even the entire UN, all of the agencies of the UN, including the World Health Organization and the UN Human Rights Agencies, and even the UN drug agencies, so the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, have all now said, and there is public statements on this, have all now said we should not criminalize people just for their drug use. So people caught in possession of small amounts of drugs for their own personal use, we should not criminalize them. Moving on to point 2, have we reached a tipping point with legalization and regulation? Well, I think it's reasonable to say that with cannabis, we've almost reached that tipping point. So, as I've already said, there are countries on every continent now that are legalizing and regulating cannabis, including in Africa, including in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, in North America, in Australasia. All across the world, there are different territories and jurisdictions legalizing cannabis. So it feels like the momentum is unstoppable now. It's like a train. It's just gathering speed. Not to mix my metaphors, but we're seeing a kind of domino effect with one country goes, another country goes, and others follow them. In Europe, in the European Union, for example, it was only about 4 or 5 years ago that Luxembourg became the first country to announce that they were planning to legalize drugs. But now we have 6 countries: Luxembourg, Malta, Germany, Switzerland, Czech Republic, and I can't remember the other one, but there is another one. There's 6.
Malta.
Which?
Malta.
Malta. I said Malta. There's another one, but anyway. But yes, but in Europe, it's accelerating, and you've seen it with the US states. So Colorado and Washington legalized in 2012, and now 21 US states. Almost half the population of the US have legalized cannabis. But with other drugs, no, we're not really there. I mean, there is the beginning of a debate on legalization of psychedelics. There's a couple of states, Colorado and Oregon, have legalized therapeutic access to psilocybin and psychedelic plants. We're beginning to see some interesting debates on MDMA regulation in the Netherlands, ecstasy regulation. And we're beginning to see a real debate on coca and cocaine regulation, which I'm going to talk about later, in Colombia and a few other places now as well. So we're not, I think, even if you wanted to argue that we're at a tipping point with cannabis, I don't think we're there with other drugs yet. But what cannabis has done is it's opened up space for the debate on other drugs. We're beginning to see high-level forums, parliaments, mainstream media debating the legalization of other drugs in the same way they were debating the legalization and regulation of cannabis 10 years ago. And like I said, 12, 15 years ago, nobody would have thought it was possible that we would see cannabis legalization on every continent with, 12, 15, 20 jurisdictions now having actually legalized it. But the pace of change has happened, and it's happened surprisingly fast. And I think now we're beginning to see with other drugs, I think we may see a similar acceleration of the debate with these other drugs too. And I'll come back to that when we discuss cocaine in a few minutes. Every argument for pragmatic reform that's been made in the past has been won. And if you think about it, the arguments for harm reduction, things like needle exchanges and methadone prescribing, in the 1980s and 90s, it was very controversial, but we won that debate. The arguments for decriminalization that I was just talking about, again, they were very controversial. You're challenging the war on drugs, but those arguments have been won, and the change is happening. And now the arguments with cannabis legalization, which have been made for years, the Beatles were talking about cannabis legalization in the 1960s, and it took a long time to get going and actually start happening. But from 2012 with Colorado and Washington, and from 2013, where Uruguay became the first member state, first country to legalize cannabis, those arguments have been made in mainstream mainstream media and in parliaments and senates and congresses around the world, and they've been won. So it's only a matter of time. We win all of these arguments eventually, and the more people that make them, and I'm looking at all of you, the faster that happens. So just a couple of points here on what are the obstacles to change? Why is it taking so long? I mean, here's me saying, look, it's really happening fast, but actually, the war on drugs began in 1961. If we look at the UN Single Convention on Drugs, so we've had it for 62 years now. And we still have a war on drugs, that we are still having this argument despite it being a terrible failure. So why is that? I think if we want to understand how to achieve change, we need to understand what is preventing change. And the first point here is that the threat-based narrative of the war on drugs. So drugs have been framed, they are described in the popular narrative as a threat, whether it's a threat to our health, whether it's a threat to our families. In particular, drugs are shown as a threat to our children. And in many cases, they're seen as an almost existential threat to society itself, to our very values. You know, the very fabric of society is threatened by drugs. And in that context, a war on drugs, it's a bit like a war on, you know, an invading enemy, or you know, it's very polarized. You have this very moral binary arguments of good and evil, and drugs are evil, and I am good, and I'm going to fight those drugs because they're bad. And it's very simplistic. It's almost childish. It has a sort of quite a kind of almost religious dimension to it, of this good and evil. And you know, drugs are described as evil in the 1961 Single Convention on Drugs. It's the only UN document that uses the word evil, is the Drug Convention. And drugs are evil, and we have a war on, you know, you have a war on this evil. And in that context, you know, if you have a war on something that's evil, it almost becomes good in and of itself. If you're fighting something evil, if it's like you're fighting the Nazis or, you know, Hitler, then your anything you do is automatically justified, and you don't need the same standards of evidence and argument and justification that you would normally have with any other social or public health policy. So the threat-based narrative of the war on drugs is a big problem, and it's something that we need to get past. The second point is this idea of conflating or confusing the harms of drug use, because of drug use, you know, it's not that there are obviously harms associated with drug use. Drug use isn't safe. All drug use has some risks. I obviously make an argument that drug risks are increased when those drugs are illegal. But we need to be honest and say drug use is risky. But the problem is that most of the harms that we see and experience are created by drug prohibition rather than the drugs themselves. So the cartels in Mexico and all the violence and chaos and horror of the war on drugs in Mexico, the cartels aren't drugs. They are there because of drug prohibition. It's a bit like when they banned alcohol in the US, and you had Al Capone and other mafiosi. So a lot of the harms that we associate, the bad things that we associate with drugs, aren't to do with drugs themselves. They're to do with drug prohibition. But what the drug war on drugs narrative does is it mixes all of those things up. And it's just, and it becomes this kind of amorphous threat. And it goes back to point one about the threat-based narrative. The threat of drugs, it's not just the threat of drug use and the harms of drugs. It's actually this collective threat of drug prohibition. And of course, drug prohibition makes the harms of drugs much, much worse. You know, people using heroin that's been mixed with fentanyl are much, much more likely to die because they don't know how strong it is, or because it's adulterated and poisoned with fentanyl, for example. So the third point is about populist political narratives and media sensationalism. You've all seen politicians, they like populist law and order. They like to show how tough they are. They like to flex their political muscles by announcing a war on drugs or a big crackdown on the cartels. And we see this all the time, and it's completely divorced from reason and evidence and science, because those crackdowns and those enforcement approaches don't work and are usually actively harmful. They're counterproductive, but they can work from a populist political perspective. And politicians are kind of addicted to some of those populist political narratives. And the media, there's a sort of symbiotic relationship between populist politicians and media that feeds on sensationalism. Media loves a good drug story. They love a good, a child dying taking drugs, or a violent cartel. These are things that sell newspapers. These are things that get clicks on Twitter and on the internet. These are things that get viewers onto your TV channel. So there's this really uncomfortable relationship between populist politicians and media sensationalism when it comes to drugs. The fourth obstacle is vested interest in drug war institutions. Now, this is a real problem because, and it's a very acute problem in Mexico, particularly at the moment, because you have police and military and political institutions that are dedicated to fighting the war on drugs, that derive enormous resources and power because they are fighting the war on drugs. Not because the war on drugs is being won, not because the war on drugs can ever be won, not because the war on drugs is working, but it's become institutionalized. And, you know, if you've been in one of these institutions fighting the war on drugs for your whole career, and that's where your money comes from, and that's what it's very difficult to step away from that and go, you know what, I've just wasted my entire career fighting this complete stupid war on drugs, and I've made everything way worse. It's very difficult. And there's also just a lot of good old-fashioned corruption. There's a lot of money invested in these institutions, and there's a lot of corruption associated with it. And the final point is point 5, which is that there is a generally poor understanding of the alternatives. You know, even people who understand that the war on drugs has failed and that the war on drugs is highly problematic, they don't always call for reform because they don't understand reform. The idea of legalizing and regulating drugs for many people is very counterintuitive. At a gut level, it seems like a really strange thing to be doing. You know, why would we legalize drugs? They're so dangerous. They're so bad. Do you want more people doing drugs? Do you want our children taking drugs? You know, instinctively, a lot of people react to legalization and regulation of drugs, you know, with horror, you know. But a key part of that is that they don't understand what the alternatives are. And we, as advocates and reformers, we need to convince them of, to give them a vision of what an alternative would look like and how it would work, and give them a vision that they can believe in, both whether it's politicians, whether it's the general public, whether it's police, whether it's people in, doctors or lawyers, people in different institutions, different regions, different demographics. They need to understand what the vision of an alternative to the war on drugs looks like and what it means to them. And if we don't do that, we'll never achieve change. Just very quickly, some key messaging. I think it's useful to emphasize the idea of retaking control. So one of the things that you often get talked about with the war on drugs is that, you know, drugs are under control, or we're trying to control drugs. And, you know, that even in law, we talk about controlled drugs. But of course, when you prohibit drugs, you give up control. You have no control over drugs that are illegal. So I think emphasizing the idea that we take control, so we would control the drug markets rather than the cartels controlling the drug markets, can be a strong message. A second idea is that we should regulate drugs because they are risky, not because they're safe. I've always been very wary of arguing, for example, with cannabis, that, you know, cannabis, it's not so bad for you, it's a safe drug, it's fine, we should legalize it and regulate it. I don't think it's a useful argument to make, because we also need to regulate cocaine and heroin and ecstasy and drugs which are clearly more risky than cannabis. And I think rather than trying to say drugs are safe or that they're not risky, we should regulate them because they are risky. And that's a good argument to make. And it diffuses this suggestion that somehow you are pro-drugs or you're arguing that drugs are safe. Don't go there. We want to regulate drugs because they are risky. They're too risky to be left in the hands of the cartels and unregulated dealers. We should regulate them to help keep people safe, because drugs are risky in the same way that alcohol is risky, tobacco is risky, pharmaceuticals are risky, driving fast cars is risky. These are all things that we regulate because they are risky If they weren't risky, we wouldn't need to regulate them. Third point, regulation is not a panacea. We're not going to, it's not a silver bullet, as we say in the UK. When we legalize drugs, it's not like all of the problems are going to disappear. We need to be clear about that. When we regulate drugs, the cartels won't just disappear and go and get a job selling flowers or working in McDonald's or something. And it won't happen overnight. This is something that's going to take some time. We've had the war on drugs for generations now, and I think it's going to take another generation to slowly unpick and unravel it. So we need to be honest about what legalization and regulation can achieve and what the time span will be for it to do that. And finally, we need to learn the mistakes that we've made from alcohol and tobacco and do better than that. Because many people will point to alcohol and tobacco and go, look at all the problems with alcohol and tobacco. They're really problematic. There's loads of people die and crash their cars when they're drunk. Loads of people, beat up their families when they're drunk. Loads of people die from lung cancer from tobacco. I think we need to be able to look at those experiences we've had with alcohol and tobacco and say, this worked and this didn't work, or this bit was good and this bit was bad. We need to learn from the mistakes and the successes with alcohol and tobacco and show that we can do better, that regulation can be better than either of those things, and that as we move forward, we can do better. And I think I'm going to stop there. I've gone on for too long already. If there's any questions, maybe we can answer them. If not, we could take a short break. I'm going to stop sharing that. Okay, a couple of questions. Daniel?
Hey, thanks, Steve. So something that I constantly think about in regards to regulation is that it feels like the steps that we're doing, they're a bit too shy. And the problem is that if we do regulation in a way that is too shy, it's simply not going to work. And we're going to continue having the problems that we are having up to today with the war on drugs and with drug trafficking and so on and so on and so on. But the thing is that society is really not ready for something radical, which is really what we need. So like a really good example here is, for example, you were mentioning that it would be a really good idea to have still like an age limit on how young can people be before they access drugs. But if you're a kid, I feel like in every country, 15-year-old kids can find much easier access to cannabis than they can to alcohol. Yeah, so like in a way, that would be a good argument for saying that we should allow 15-year-old kids to access legal cannabis, because at least we know that it's not going to be full of pesticide and so on and so on and so on. But of course, that's never going to fly democratically. That's never going to fly politically. So what's your standing on how much, how quick should the change be? Because at the same time, we run into the problem that if we start regulating and it keeps on giving us the same problems, then the drug warriors are going to keep saying, oh, of course it's not working. We need to go back to the way it was and harder.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And, I don't think there's any easy single answer to that. For me, it's about balance. Getting the balance right. I agree. I think it would be great if we could move fast, but there is an urgency here. If I could wave my magic wand and legally regulate all drugs across the whole world, I would do that. But like you say, there is a political dimension. We have to move within what is politically possible. And so it may be that we have to make compromises. And this becomes an issue of political strategy, really. Do we legalize cannabis first? Do we then do magic mushrooms? Do we do the safer drugs first at one end, or do we then should we make heroin available on prescription? I think part of it is what is politically possible. But I think there is also a reasonable argument you can make that we are moving into uncharted territory. These are new ideas. They haven't been, we don't have a legal cocaine market anywhere, and we don't know what would happen. So I think it's also, I wouldn't necessarily agree with it, but you can make a good argument, I think, that there is, we call it the precautionary principle, that we should move slowly and evaluate what is happening. Not necessarily too slowly, but we should move in small steps and see how things are working, so that if we make a mistake, we can take a step back. If things are going well, we can take 2 steps forward. And so I think there is both a political dimension and a pragmatic dimension. But I think really it's a political strategic question. And it's also a question for each jurisdiction to democratically decide. You know, I think if a political party makes a case for a more radical reform platform and they are elected, they then have a mandate to do that. But if there is no political will to make those changes, it becomes very, very difficult. But often, you know, I think if you look back at most drug law reforms, most of them were led by, not by governments, but by, civil society. They were organizations pioneering harm reduction, taking the risks. They were people, local police forces decriminalizing by default, by saying, we're not going to arrest people anymore. There was ballot initiatives, cannabis legalization in Colorado, and it wasn't government led. These were popular ballots. So if you can get the people on side, if you can get the public on side, you can get a majority in the public, then you can make change happen. But it's very difficult to push change, to force change, when you don't have either the political support or the public support. So there's a sequencing issue, and it's going to be different for different jurisdictions. So I hope that's an okay answer, Daniel. Thelma.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you very much for your conference. And I have 2 questions about the regulation for price. The first is where it has to be implemented by force by the government based on tax, or it's only the role for the producers. And the second, if you believe that this regulation is more effective than other types of public policies, such as awareness or information on the use of the responsibility of you. I'm sorry, I'm not very good with this. Or on the responsible use of drugs. Sorry, I get a lot of nervous.
So on price, I think price is, like I said, price is a very important tool. And it really, again, it depends on what form of regulatory model you choose. So you can have, some places have a state monopoly, so that the government produces and sells alcohol, for example. They used to do that in Russia. In some Canadian provinces, they have a state monopoly on the retailing of cannabis. You have a blank slate. When you're coming to legalize a drug, you can design your market model however you want. And that can include price controls. You can have either fixed prices, or you could have minimum prices, maximum prices, differentiated prices, depending on the different products. So you could do things like, you could say, okay, we're going to make more potent cannabis. If we think more potent cannabis is more risky, we'll make that more expensive. So as a way of encouraging people to smoke milder cannabis. And they do that with alcohol, for example. There are some countries that have a kind of tiered tax regime, so that stronger beer over 3% or over 6% or over 9% or whatever, it pays higher tax. And the idea with that is you use your pricing and tax controls to influence behaviors in positive ways. And some of those things work and some of them don't. I think you have to follow the evidence. But those are decisions that we would get to make when we legalize. We decide what we think is going to work. And if you want to read what Transform thinks, you can read the cannabis book, and there's a chapter in there on price controls and tax and so on. The other question was about regulation and education, risk education. For me, you can do both. I think you can. I think regulation enables better education, because you have information on the packaging. So it will say it says what the drug is, how strong it is. it will say what the risks is, it will say what a normal dosage is. And when you buy it, you would buy it from a vendor who was trained to give advice on health and safety and risks. So when you regulate a drug, there are many ways the government and the regulatory system can intervene to encourage safer patterns of use and encourage a more healthy relationship with drugs. Yeah, that would be my answer. Esteban, I think you've got your hand up.
Hola, hola a todos y todas. Voy a hacer mi pregunta en español y pues esperando la traducción de Jonas. Mi pregunta como que parte, bueno, creo que la insistencia en un modelo de regulación estricta parte como de una lectura de impactos en clave social y en clave pues humana de las sustancias y de los regímenes de prohibición y de liberalización estricta. Entonces, la necesidad de hablar de una regulación pues parte de esos impactos en términos pues sociales y humanos. Y creo que hay también como en la propuesta general de Transform una intención como de regular sustancias, como ya lo mencionabas al inicio, como la psilocibina y como el LSD. Digamos que según como los estudios que hay, son drogas que tienen un impacto muchísimo menor que las que ahorita están en la boca de la regulación, que es la cocaína y el cannabis y bueno, y otras que están reguladas ya como el alcohol o el tabaco. Entonces me preguntaba así sobre estas sustancias, ¿no funcionaría mejor un modelo como de reducción de daños fuerte más que un modelo de regulación y un modelo pues que también incluya el ejercicio de pedagogía? Esto también teniendo en cuenta como que los estados pues latinoamericanos tienen unos niveles de acción y una capacidad de ejecución de política pública mucho más limitado y que pues siento que hay esfuerzos que se pueden encaminar a pues a situaciones o a sustancias de mayores impactos como pues precisamente lo es la cocaína o el cannabis, aunque el cannabis no tiene tanto, pero bueno, por su situación de ilegalidad y pues estar inmerso en un mercado ilegal en manos de actores criminales transnacionales, pues sí tiene su cierto impacto por ahí. Esa es mi pregunta, no sé si Jonas que la puede sintetizar.
Jonas, give me the short version.
So the very short version is, the question is whether in a context where you don't really have that much state capacity, like in Latin America, where there's more problems with implementing more comprehensive public policies and maybe a regulatory system, as you were talking about, whether it wouldn't make more sense to go for like a very comprehensive harm reduction approach.
Okay,
substances instead
that's
of
a good question. Thanks, Esteban. I hope you can understand my answer.
Is that all right? Sorry, is that?
Oh, was it? Do you want to say something?
Specifically about LSD and mushroom, psilocybin substance.
Well, I mean, I think you're right that a lot of countries that have weak institutions, I think you can make an argument that if they're not very good at regulating alcohol and tobacco, they're not very good at regulating pharmaceuticals, they're not very good at regulating anything. Why do we think they can suddenly regulate cannabis or cocaine or anything like that, or LSD and mushrooms? I think my argument to that is that, well, there's two sides to it. The first one is, I think some regulation is better than zero regulation. And at the moment, when drugs are prohibited, we have zero regulation. There's no, we can't influence anything. We don't influence the price. We don't influence purity or availability or packaging or any of those things that I talked about. So I think any steps towards some regulation of the market where you can generate some tax revenue, you can help inform use to make it safer. I think even small steps towards that are positive. And if we regulate some drugs first, maybe we can start to build regulatory institutional knowledge and expertise and capacity. But like I said, I think this is going to take time. And I think we have to be honest that it's not going to be a miracle that cures everything overnight. And I think the second point is that prohibition is not neutral. The war on drugs is not neutral on this question, because the war on drugs fuels the cartels and crime and insecurity, and it actively undermines institutions. It actively undermines all of the institutions of state, the police, the government, the judiciary. All of our regulatory institutions can be corrupted or undermined or starved of resources in different ways. So the war on drugs not only prevents any regulation happening, it undermines all of the institutions of the state. So it makes weak institutions more weak. And hopefully, as we move towards regulation, you begin to create some space in which institutions can be strengthened. I know it's not a perfect answer, and I know it was a very long question. We could probably spend half an hour discussing that, but we've got 4 more questions. Let's just, because I wanted to talk a little bit about cocaine as well. Can I just take these, or 5 questions? Can I take these 5 questions quickly? I'm going to write, and I will make some notes. And if you can keep them fairly brief, otherwise we won't have time to talk about anything else, which is fine. I mean, I love doing the questions. Maybe we should just forget the cocaine bit, but I thought you might find it interesting.
No, the cocaine bit.
Okay, well, look, keep the questions fairly short, and I'll try and keep my answers short as well, which I struggle with. But anyway, Lara Blanco Lampud.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, Lara.
Oh, nice to see you 10 years later. We are together in Uruguay when you came to advise us for the regulation, and you accused me of being naive.
Oh no!
Yeah, you remember me? Okay. I know what I don't want to talk about the young people and the authorization of their fathers to buy cannabis, legal cannabis, because it's already done. But there's a big question now. I hear you talking about the price in the blueprint, and when you advise the National Drug Board in Uruguay, you told us we have to put the price at the same as the black market. And it's really, I think you review this, but it was really a big problem in Uruguay to have this regulation, because there's no company who want to grow at that prices because they can't afford the cost. That's a good point to review, because the illegal market is not the health market, and the costs are very different. We used to smoke Paraguayan brick, and now the companies have a lot of problems to produce at these prices. So we have no companies who wants to grow for the state, for the pharmacies, and the Institute of Regulation and Control of Cannabis have to make some agrees to give them some license for medical cannabis, just to afford the cost they can have producing and distributing, and also the packaging and so on is for $1.25.
Right. I mean, Laura, so I think you're absolutely right about what you said about review, because what we were doing in 2011, it was the first time people had done it, and we were being quite cautious. And I think there was always an understanding that we had to see what was working and what wasn't working, and be willing to be flexible and evolve and change. And I don't think everything I said was right. I don't think everything in Uruguay they did was right. I mean, I think it was a good start, but the policy needs to evolve. And the point you make, clearly there was a problem there, and I think that needs to be responded to. And I understand in Uruguay as well, the pharmacies, there weren't enough places selling, and people didn't want to be the membership. I didn't agree with the membership thing, by the way, but I think evaluation and monitoring and review is really, really important. And I think policy has to be willing to be flexible and evolve and acknowledge when things don't work, acknowledge when mistakes were made, or when, you know, even if they were well-intentioned, if things aren't working, you have to change them. And clearly that was a problem. And I agree. I agree with you. And I'm sorry I messed it up.
Maybe you know, but we have a lot of growers in jail now, and it was a very bad law what we finished approved in the parliament. So there's a lot of black and they didn't regulate the seeds. 10 years later, they didn't regulate the access of the clones or the genetics. They didn't regulate many things they have to do, and also the medical cannabis. So that it's not a very good evaluation we have. And my second question is about the psilocybin, because we are allowed to consume. And now there's a new law in Uruguay that is a project, and they want to regulate it. And in the regulation, we are very, 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 ¿cómo se dice? It's not good for us, because we have the right to consume, we have the right to produce, and in the regulation, we will be only in a medical state. So only a doctor can give up the psilocybin, and only a therapist can go on in our therapist.
Well, I think that's stupid. I think we've got a new. I think I mentioned at the beginning, we've got a book coming out soon on regulation, and we think that you should be able to grow, self-cultivate mushrooms and forage for them within a fully decriminalized model. We think you should have something a bit more like the cannabis social clubs, a cannabis social clubs model for growing and sharing. We think there should be a retail model as well, and that there should be a supervised, guided experience model. So you would have 4 different models, but I think only having a medical model is clearly stupid. I mean, it's ridiculous. It's far too restrictive. So I agree with you on that too, Lara. And hopefully you can read my book and then send me an email and tell me what I've got wrong. Eugene.
Hi, Steve. Can you hear me?
Yeah, great.
I'm going to try to be quick. This is taking in consideration the benzylpiperazine experience you shared on stimulant use. My question is regarding the effects of new psychoactive substances regulation in the shift or the rest of the market dynamics. In the case of new psychoactive substances, there is evidence of how the attraction and preference of use of certain substances inside a drug group, they can be guided by the legal status more than the preference of the effects of the certain drug. So taking into account this dynamic of use, in which the legal status is the reason that justifies the existence of some of the new psychoactive substances, can we use this kind of phenomenon in our favor by choosing a certain order in which we regulate certain safer substances, to say so we can influence a shift of behavior in the market?
So. I mean, I think so, the novel psychoactive substances are a good argument for the failure of prohibition. You know, you're creating new problems. Prohibition is just creating new problems, like the synthetic cannabis drugs, like the synthetic cathinone stimulants, like fentanyl and all the different fentanyl analogs. These are all born of prohibition. It's because, you know, all the synthetic cannabis drugs, they only emerged because we didn't have actual cannabis. And like you say, generally people prefer the natural ones, or the ones that are more established, that, you know, people don't want to use a random powder or a random pill. I think in terms of the order, which, yes, I mean, I think if you legalized magic mushrooms, MDMA and cannabis, you would probably, you know, cover about 90% of the recreational drug market. And the market for most NPS would probably disappear. But, you know, there are still going to be demand for, you know, maybe amphetamines or cocaine. And we have to be realistic that sometimes I think when if one of these drugs establishes a market, it's quite difficult to stop it. But I think, yes, going forward, I would certainly think about, well, I mean, it's kind of happening anyway. Cannabis is being legalized first, probably now some magic mushrooms, some psychedelic plants, maybe MDMA will be the first of the kind of synthetic stimulants. I think it makes sense. I mean, but we need to be careful not to sort of privilege certain drugs and users of certain drugs and then continue to criminalize people who use other drugs or criminalize them even more. Say, if you use those drugs, you're okay, but use these drugs and we're gonna punish you. I think we have to be very, very, very careful with that. I hope that's okay. I'm gonna move on. Rodrigo.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. First of all, I'm side with the 7. If we, in your conception, if we regulate all the drugs, that doesn't mean that, well, of course, the price is going to be up because of the tax, but that doesn't mean that the cartels are not going to innovate and going to make like drugs that are not fulfilling with the law. So how we can fight the idea of illegal market, even though there's a regulation and a legislation in the market?
I think you have to make, you see, if someone can buy, you know, if you could buy legal MDMA and legal amphetamines and legal cocaine, you know, there's no market for just random new NPS. There's no people would choose things that they know and that they like and that they want, that meet their needs. The demand, I'm not saying it would disappear completely, but the demand for those other, you know, the market for other drugs other stimulants would effectively disappear. It's a bit like cannabis. People would never have got into synthetic cannabis if they just had cannabis. There's no market for synthetic cannabis in the Netherlands because they've had legal cannabis there since the 1970s. You know, there's no market for, you know, moonshine alcohol in the UK, or very small, because if people want alcohol, they just go to a shop and buy it. And also, if something is legal and regulated, it's not just about price. It also has some kind of guarantee of quality and quality control. And, you know, if it says it's 10% on the packet, that it will be 10% THC, or you know that, like you do with your alcohol or your cigarettes. So I don't think we can get rid of the illegal market completely, but we can shrink it substantially. We can get rid of 60, 70, 80% of the illegal market but we have to make the drugs, we have to make the legal offer attractive enough so that people choose the legal products. And when I say attractive, it has to be good quality and the price has to be right, and it has to be the drugs that people want. You have to supply, it's about supply and demand. But those are choices that we make, and you have to look at what happens, and you have to adapt your regulatory system and your price controls and your other different elements of your regulatory system to respond to the market. You know, you can change behaviors over a long period of time, but in the short term, you have to meet the demand as it exists. That would be my answer. But just to say, a lot of these things are discussed in our various books, so please do go and look at them. I think if it's all right, Rebecca, I think if it's okay, because I've only got about 20 minutes left, I might just talk about cocaine for a few minutes, and then maybe if you can keep your question till the end. Is that all right? I don't want to...
Yeah, absolutely. That's fine. Thank you.
Sorry, Rebecca. I feel a bit mean. Okay, so I'm just going to do a little bit on cocaine because I think it's quite interesting. I'm going to skip that slide because it was about the UK. Oh, but basically that slide was just saying that cocaine use has been going up in the UK, and cocaine has got cheaper and cocaine has got purer in the UK, despite increasing amounts of policing and despite increasing amounts of seizures. So all the drug war things that we're doing in the UK with cocaine are completely not working, and the market is moving in the wrong direction from a prohibitionist point of view. If you look at the global context of cocaine, the market is actually quite small. So it's worth around $85 to $165 billion annually. So that doesn't sound small, but actually it's only about 400 tons of cocaine is consumed. I mean, this is according to the UN. So this data is maybe a little bit suspect, but according to the UN, around 400 tons of cocaine is consumed every year. And actually, that's not that much. If you think about it, that's about 60,000 acres. That's and 60,000 acres, just to put that in perspective, is a square with 15-mile sides. So it's actually quite a small area. It's 15 miles. It's about the size of New York and Brooklyn. You could grow all the cocaine in the world in this little area. It's really not that big. And you could put all the cocaine that's consumed globally into 15 shipping containers, the ones that they put on the back of those big boats that go across the oceans. So the market for cocaine is actually quite small, but it's hugely valuable. It's worth like $100 billion because the value of cocaine is inflated so much by the war on drugs. So, and just to make a comparison, that's 60,000 acres of cocaine, of coca leaf. This is what you see on the right here. These kids harvesting coca leaf in Colombia. Compare that to 10 million acres for coffee. So 10 million acres next to 60,000 acres. But those two markets, interestingly, are worth about the same amount of money. So the global coffee market is worth around 85 to 160 or whatever it is, $100 billion a year as well. So they're worth the same amount, but cocaine's tiny compared to it. So this is just trying to give you a sense of the economics of prohibition. And cocaine is expensive because it's illegal, not because of any. If it was a legal product, it would only cost, it only costs about $1 a gram to produce, but it sells for $100 a gram. The global context, we've seen rising production despite all the enforcement. We've seen the enrichment of organized crime groups. We've seen all of the problems of violence and insecurity and corruption, undermining of state institutions. We've seen the impacts of both trafficking and enforcement fall most heavily on the most vulnerable members of our community. So migrant workers, poor people who end up, working in illegal cocaine markets as a form of economic survival. And we've also seen what I've called here a Darwinian effect of enforcement on cartels. And this is really that when you put policing, when you police against cartels and illegal drug markets, it tends to be the weakest or the most stupid ones that get caught. The smart ones and the most violent ones, or the most corrupt ones, or the ones with the most guns, they're the ones that survive. So you get a kind of survival of the fittest, hence Darwinian, a survival of the fittest effect, through which the most violent and innovative and entrepreneurial cartels are the ones that survive. Enforcement tends to catch the low-hanging fruit. Just let me keep an eye on the time. This point was really about trying to compare the UK experience with the experience in Mexico and Latin America. In Latin America, my experience in Mexico is that the focus on policy priorities is much more on security and cartels and institutional threats and development issues. Whereas in North America and Europe, the focus is much more on public health and addiction. There is still an emphasis on crime, obviously, but the balance of the sort of political narratives is much more skewed in Europe towards public health, and I think much more skewed in the Americas, particularly Central and Latin America, towards security issues. And the result of that is that the public debate, I really noticed it when I traveled to Mexico or other countries, the public debate has a very different complexion. People aren't really talking so much about cocaine addiction or problematic cocaine use, not least because cocaine use is relatively low compared to North America and Europe. They're talking about security and the cartel. So the policy debates have a very different complexion in these two different regions. This is our book. These are free online as PDFs. You don't have to buy them. I mean, I think there are print versions available if you want, but please go to the Transform website. It's transformdrugs.org, or go to the MUCD site, and it's available in English and Spanish, and you can read it at your leisure. In terms of what we proposed for cocaine, cocaine's really interesting because you have the coca leaf, you have cocaine powder, and you have crack cocaine, or pasta base, as it's called in Uruguay, I believe, or bazuco in Brazil, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. But it's the same drug, essentially. It's the same cocaine alkaloid, but vastly different in how it's used, its effects, and its risks. So coca leaf is very safe. It's more like sort of coffee or Red Bull or something. Cocaine powder, it can be problematic, but it's often used in moderation. And crack and bazooka and pasta base is more associated with problematic high risk use and dependency or addiction. So you have these different preparations of the same drug, but very different patterns of use and patterns of risk, and very different policy responses would be needed. So what we've proposed is that you would have a light touch, a low regulation model for coca leaf, a bit like they already do in Colombia and Bolivia in particular, where it would be regulated much in the way of coffee or other low risk stimulant products. For cocaine, you would have a much more strictly regulated model reflecting the risks. As I was talking about earlier, more risky drugs, it justifies a greater level of state regulation. So we've suggested that you could have pharmacy sales, so not necessarily from pharmacies, but something like a pharmacy, where you'd have a trained vendor. You could only buy cocaine a fixed amount for personal use, and probably to avoid commercialization and promotion, it could at least start as a government monopoly. So that the government would own the retail outlets in the same way that in Sweden and some Scandinavian countries, the government has a monopoly on alcohol retailing, or in Quebec in Canada, the provincial government has a monopoly on cannabis retailing. So what that does is it prevents some of the risks of over commercialization by making it a government monopoly, at least in the first instance. And then for crack and bazooka and pasta base, we wouldn't have a retail model. We don't envisage that these products would be sold in stores in the same way that coca leaf or cocaine could be. But you would have a harm reduction model, not an arm reduction. Sorry, that's a typo. You have a harm reduction model. And of course, if you can get cocaine powder, you can make crack anyway. It's very easy to make cocaine into smokable crack in your kitchen with some basic kitchen chemistry. And we also looked at options for new sort of low a product. We wonder whether a good idea might be to have a product that sort of sat somewhere between coca leaf and cocaine powder. So maybe some sort of oral lozenges or coca leaf pouches, a bit like snus. Sort of oral products that had a bit more kick than just the coca leaf, but they weren't. You didn't necessarily snort them, snort a powder. So some sort of media, bit more like sort of Red Bull, perhaps, a kind of cocaine-based drinks. But we go into a lot more detail on this in the book. So if you want to sort of dig into the detail and the reasoning behind it, you can have a look at the book. And this table here, which I've because I care about you, I've put it in this. I put from the Spanish book version. This is our 3-tiered model, copied over from the book, sort of summarizing the 3-tiered model, and this includes amphetamines and MDMA as well. But please do go and look at the book if you want to read more details on that. I've got into a bit more detail here, but I don't know how much time we've got. We've only got a few minutes, but in terms of cocaine production, I think it's really interesting to note that there is already a legal cocaine market. This product here is a medical cocaine. It's the coca leaf is grown in Peru, I think. It's flown to the US by the DEA. The cocaine is taken out. The decocainized leaf goes to the Coca-Cola company to make Coca-Cola. And the cocaine is used for medical uses. It's a topical anesthetic. And the biggest user of medical cocaine, it's the United Kingdom. Don't know why. I think it's a historical thing, but anyway. And this image on the right is a mock-up we did of what legal cocaine might look like for non-medical use. But essentially, it's because it's a pharmaceutical product. We don't want to have branding and advertising. We thought probably the sensible thing to do would be to have it essentially like a pharmaceutical product. So we've got packaging, pharmaceutical style packaging. Vendors, I've already talked a little bit about this. I won't go into it, but there's some examples. The pictures, there's a pharmacy. The picture in the middle is a Quebec state monopoly cannabis retailing outlet. And the picture on the right is in Sweden, I think Sweden, a state monopoly alcohol retailer. So this is to capture this idea of strict controls, more like a pharmacy. This is for cocaine powder, and a trained vendor who will be able to give you kind of information on safety and enforce regulatory controls on things like age and intoxication and rationing. So some key lessons. I've already touched on some of these things. Clearly, we need to learn the lessons from alcohol, tobacco, and pharmaceuticals, what we've got right and what we've got wrong. We need to be very careful of the tensions between public health and private profit. And so that suggests that ideas like state monopoly retailing and very strict bans on marketing and advertising would be sensible. And yes, exploring these models that mitigate these risks of over-commercialization. So state monopolies, not-for-profit organizations, and so on. A really important point, which I haven't really had time to talk much about, and I'm sorry I've only got a few more minutes left, but it's really important that regulation doesn't reproduce the iniquities and inequalities of prohibition. There's no point legalizing drugs with a focus on some of the most vulnerable in society and then creating new capitalist models where the vulnerable members of society are still marginalized and still suffer and don't get to enjoy any of the benefits. And in fact, it's really important that some of the benefits of regulation in terms of tax revenue, in terms of participation in any new industries, whether it's production or retailing, are directed towards repairing some of the harms of the drug war. And we've seen with some of the cannabis social equity programs in the US that this is possible. So some of these programs in the US, they redirect tax revenue, and it's 40% of the tax revenue from cannabis in New York and 70% of the tax revenue in New Jersey is redirected back into community projects in the communities that have been most negatively impacted by the war on drugs, which, if you think about it, is pretty amazing. In America, 70% of the tax revenue from this entire new cannabis market is being directed back into the most impacted communities for social programs. And they have these other programs that encourage participation of impacted communities in the new industry. So they have preferential licensing, they have training programs, they have loans and grant programs to get people the capital to open a business. And of course, you need to make sure that the impacted communities are part of the policy design process. If you want to build social justice and social equity into your policy, you need to get those people involved, because if they're not, it's not gonna work out for them. This is Evo Morales, the former president of Bolivia. They have legalized coca relatively successfully in Bolivia. It's not all been perfect, but you know, there's a very interesting model there. There's some details about that in the book. There was an interesting court case brought by our colleagues at MUCD that cocaine is in fact legalized for 2 people in Mexico. It's a start. We're not there yet, but you know, it just shows that some change is possible. The same reasoning that was used for the cannabis court case has been used for cocaine, but you can ask Lisa Sanchez more about that when she does her lecture, but it's a fascinating story. This is an example of some safe supply drug sales in Vancouver. It's all completely informal. Technically, it's illegal, but these people are producing drugs and packaging them, and they test the drugs to make sure that they are pure and safe, and then they sell them or give them away to dependent drug users, or mostly people with problematic drug use, in the downtown east side part of Vancouver. And what I'm trying to do with this is really just to let you know that there is coca and cocaine legalization. It's not completely theoretical. We're beginning to see the first movements. And in 2021, there was a cocaine regulation bill that was introduced into the Senate in Colombia. It was kind of some of the work that we did in our book helped inform that bill. It won its first vote in the Health Committee, but fell due to the legislative calendar, mainly because there was a presidential election. But one of the senators who worked on that bill was this guy, Gustavo Petro, the new president of Colombia. So he worked on the on the coca and cocaine legalization bill with us and this our little team of senators. And he's now president. And the first thing he did was go to the UN and give a big speech about why we need to end the war on drugs. So maybe there is hope for some movement in Colombia. Maybe not. Maybe I'm being too optimistic, but it's not impossible. This was a piece in The Economist. Joe Biden is too timid. It's time to legalize cocaine. The costs of prohibition outweigh the benefits. This was a big 3-page feature in The Economist. And after it was published, Gustavo Petro, the president of Colombia, tweeted the whole editorial, the full text, basically at Joe Biden, saying it's time to legalize cocaine. And it just shows to me that the cocaine legalization, that if you've got the president of Colombia tweeting about cocaine legalization to the president of the USA, it feels like this is an issue whose time has come. The debate, it's not happened yet. Obviously, it's not happened yet, but the debate has moved into the mainstream. I'll skip the Truth Commission. So where are we now? I don't think legalization of cocaine is coming anytime soon. in the US or in Europe. Maybe Petro will risk it and do something in Colombia. I don't know, maybe not. But I think we will see more coca leaf reforms. And it just feels like the debate is opening up. Like there's a big debate going on in Bern, which is a city in Switzerland now, because the Bern Municipal Council want to have a pilot with legal cocaine. So the fact that the debate started in Colombia, a bit like Uruguay starting the debate on cannabis, it spreads. There's the domino effect. So people at least are talking about it. And, you know, like I say, 10, 11 years ago, nowhere had legalized cocaine. Now it's on every continent. I think we're at that beginning point with the cocaine debate. It's obviously much more difficult. It's a much more challenging policy model. It's much more politically difficult. It's a much harder thing to sell to the public, but we are beginning it. And yeah, if you want to find out more, read the books and then dedicate your entire lives to campaigning and advocating for the legalization, regulation of all drugs. And I'll stop on that because, oh God, we've run out of time.
So yes, unfortunately we are run out of time.
I'm sorry.
And the next session is about to
I talk too much, Jonas.
Thanks a lot, Steve. Very optimistic.
I try to be optimistic. We've got there's reasons for optimism. There are reasons for optimism.
They need to be the idealists. Había un par de preguntas que quedaron y creo que en la discusión también salieron cosas muy interesantes, ¿no? ¿Qué tan aplicables son esas ideas para el contexto de América Latina? Había varias discusiones acerca de esto. Entonces yo creo que vamos a tener sesiones también sobre regulación en la semana al final del mes. Entonces ahí podemos profundizar muchísimo más en esto. Si tiene más preguntas para Steve, mándamelo.
Jonas, if you save the questions from the chat, maybe I can email some thoughts and answers.
I was just getting to that. So
oh, sorry.
To just send me the questions and direct messages in the chat. No, mándamelo en mensajes directos en el chat y yo los hago llegar a Steve.
And I'm sorry, Rebecca, I didn't have time for your question, but if you stick it in an email to Jonas, I'll try and do something.
No worries. I think you mostly answered it on your key, like summarizing your key points, but I'll email my question. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you.
And yeah, thanks so much, Steve. Again, we're about to start the next session. I think Jaime Arredondo is going to do the next session, is already here. So
well, enjoy the rest of the course, everybody, and yeah, good luck with everything.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Steve.
Pleasure.
Para los demás, vamos a hacer una pausa hasta las como 7:10, 7:12 y ya arrancar con Jaime Arredondo, que va a hablar sobre salud y reducción de riesgos y daños.
Sí, 10, 15 minutitos, chavos, ¿vale? Gracias.
Gracias.
Gracias, Jonas. No ha llegado Jaime, de hecho.